Hey everyone, welcome back for another episode in Adventures of Comprehension. Really glad to be here with you tonight. I am so excited to bring you tonight's content where we are going to be talking all about teaching characterization. So if this is something that you know is going to be on your scope and sequence or your lesson plans towards the beginning of the year, then this is definitely a video that you're going to want to tune into. My name is Ciera Harris, and I'm the author behind Ciera Harris Teaching. If you haven't already, drop me a comment below. Make sure to say hello, that you're here and you're watching. Let me know where you're from and what grade you will be teaching or are teaching this year. I can't wait to hear from you. Let's dive into 5 amazing tips and activities that are going to help you really dig deep into teaching characterization. So the first thing I've got for you tonight is to make sure that you're finding different ways to analyze a character. I think one of the best things that I do when I teach characterization with my students is when I teach, like, okay, we're learning about characters this week. I want to make sure that my students know that they have different lenses that they can look through when they are looking at their characters. So, for example, we may put our character traits lens on at one time when we're talking about a certain text. Then we may take those off and we'll put on character relationships lens. And then maybe another time we'll put on character change lenses. So the whole point of this is I want my students to know that there are different areas and aspects of a character that all readers should be aware of at all times. That's a lot to juggle if you think about it. It's not just characters, right? Characters is very complex and very deep. And if I teach my students to kind of section off the different components of a character and focus on each one at a time, then they're going to get a better grasp of what a character and why identifying and knowing our characters is really so important. So when it comes to analyzing characters, there's a lot of great things that you can do, but making sure you know the different areas of analyzation is step 1. So for example, this is like a little flip book that I like to do with my students. So this would be a good example of like 5 different areas of where you can analyze a character. Clearly, character traits. You can even separate this into physical and internal character traits as well. So there's technically 2 there. A character's actions, making sure your students understand that what a character does. You know, if the words like looking for adjectives like walking slowly, what does that mean? How does that represent their feelings? Feelings can be on here as well. Obviously, a character's change from beginning, middle to end. Looking at characters' relationships. How does the fact that, the character is having problems with a lot of kids in the class, or a lot of kids in the story, or look at how their relationship with their mother and their father, or if they don't have a mother or don't have a father, like look at all those relationships and how does that help build this specific character. And then of course the dialogue too, like what is the character saying that helps us understand the character more. So if you could break characterization down into components where students can really start seeing a little bit more black and white and piece by piece of how characters are built and designed, then characterization clicks a lot more easier for them. So basically what this little activity is, I take a story right here, and the story is actually different pieces too. I don't know if you can tell, they're cut and into sections, and each part of the story actually has text evidence for each one of these pieces. So the students are given the story cut up, and they have to read each piece in non-sequential order. So they may read, this piece down here first, but what they're really looking for is, what evidence am I seeing here about the character? So when they read this piece, they'll say, oh, well, this one gives me the best evidence for character relationships, so they'll glue it there. And then for this one up here, maybe they read that next and they'll say, oh, this one's the best for character actions. And so they glue them all down, and then they know they're right if the whole story is in chronological order. So it's a great little activity to focus on the different components to break down characterization, but also it's a great little self-check activity too, and sequencing activity to get your students to understand how all those components kind of work together. So I love this activity when focusing on ways to analyze a character. Another thing that I love to do is make a character wheel. This is a great for like a small group activity. But basically it's just triangles. You can cut them out. You can draw a big circle on anchor chart paper and, do the little, dividing the circle into different sections of triangles and then cut them out and then assign each section of the triangle one of the components that you're analyzing about your character. So again, it could be relationships, actions, feelings, dialogue, change, etc. All the different components that you're breaking down to really help your students understand characterization. Each one of those goes on one of the components of the wheel. And then what I basically do is have them find text evidence. What does that text evidence tell us? Draw a picture if they want to, and then they put their triangles together to create a character wheel. So it's a whole circle to kind of analyze the character. So it's fun to do in small groups where each person kind of takes their own piece, works on it on their own, presents it, and then together they have their own wheel of a character. This is another great activity you can do if you have multiple characters to analyze in a text, where different groups are working together. Each group member has their own piece of their group's character, and then each group can then present the whole wheel based on which character their group had. So group 1 would have character A, group 2 would have character B, etc. So you can really do a lot with these fun character wheel activities, but this one's great as well when it comes to analyzing characters. All right, let's move on to tip number 2 when it comes to teaching characterization. This tip is huge, and I think it's one that kind of gets brushed aside a little bit when we're thinking about teaching characters, and that is teaching schema. Teaching schema with characterization is very important. Kids love making connections to students or other students or other kids and books that they can relate to. But if you find that students are reading stories that they don't have schema for, then they're not going to be able to relate to those students or those characters in the text. So making sure that when we are picking mentor texts, or if we're leading our students in search for library books, either in our class library or our school library, or we're picking text to use from online, we want to keep this schema in our minds because we want to make sure that we're picking texts that have schema available for them for our students to access. Otherwise, the comprehension is just going to be a lot harder, and then our students are going to be able to connect to the characters in the way that they intrinsically want to. We all want to find characters that we can relate to. So if you have a student who maybe has never experienced, let's say, playing in a sport, and then you read a story where a character is losing at a basketball game, and then they have a lot of actions or words or dialogue that they say to show their feelings of, how they feel after the game. Then characters or students in your class who don't have that kind of schema, they're not going to pick up on, really what's going on there with the character. They're not going to be able to connect in ways with that character that other students in your class might. So it's really important not only to kind of predict what kind of schema our students may or may not have, but also pick the right text to allow our students to be able to have that schema, to then be able to have the right opportunity to understand characterization. So if you think about it, if a student is struggling with characterization, it may not be characterization at all. They may be able to identify actions and words in a text that help lead to characterization, but where the hole may be is their schema. So you want to really make sure that you understand how these two things are so highly connected and understand that it may not be characterization that a student is struggling with. It could be a lack of schema. So keeping that in the forefront of your mind when you're choosing text and when you're supporting students and when you're teaching characterization, having them access their schema in multiple ways. That is very important, all of it in hand. So schema, characterization, sorry, puppy. I don't know if you can see him here in the bottom corner. Wanted to say hello. Teaching schema, teaching characterization go hand in hand. All right. Hey everyone, so sorry to interrupt, but I want to make sure that you are loving the content coming from Ciera Harris Teaching on YouTube. So make sure if you are loving this to subscribe and also like and comment below. I would love to hear from you. All right, let's go on to tip number 3. Tip number 3, and I do have a fun activity for this one too. Tip number 3 is to focus on your evidence. Now, you probably think, I do this. I make the kids go back and find evidence. All right, but let's talk through this. How can we make this a little bit better? So sometimes we need to work backwards and explicitly state text evidence instead of trying to find it in the text. I love this idea. This is great for characterization. So why would we do this? So that students are able to determine what the evidence is actually saying about the character. So it's almost teaching in reverse. I'm going to give you the evidence. You tell me what this is saying about the character. The reason why we do this is so when characters come across evidence on their own, when they're reading independently, they know then how to analyze that text themselves. So rather than always saying, okay, you know that the character is stubborn, find me the evidence. If they struggle finding the evidence, it's because they don't know what text evidence looks like for characterization. We have to make sure that we are black and white, showing them evidence in a text for the different components of characterization, teaching them and showing them those pieces before we ask them to find it on their own. So this is why students struggle with text evidence, because we really haven't taught them what text evidence really looks like. So, for example, here is a fun activity you could try. So you can do this with absolute any text you have that you are working on for characterization. So what you're going to want to do is before you copy the text that you're using with your class, read through it yourself and go through and underline different areas of evidence in the story. Think about all the different areas of characterization that we just focused on. So like try to find evidence of a character trait. Try to find evidence of a character relationship or dialogue or action or feeling or change, any of those components. And then underline them, right? Then what you're going to do is you're going to assign each component a color. And you are going to have your students read through the text and color code the text evidence. So then it would look something like this. So you can see I focused on 4 different components of characterization in this one. Actions, relationships, traits, and change. And then I have everything pre-underlined. You can't tell because it's already color-coded, but that's actually underlined in black. And then the students read through it and they say, okay, I got to this point. It's underlined, which means it's text evidence, but what is that evidence showing and telling me about the character? Is this showing me, that they have a relationship with someone? Is this giving me an action that tells me more about the character? What is this doing for me? So by doing this, you're able to teach text evidence in reverse. And that not only teaches them characterization, but also how to truly find text evidence that supports characterization at the same time. So this is a big one. This is one of my best tips that I love giving teachers. And guess what? It works with more than just characterization. It works with basically any skill. So this is something I highly recommend you try when you're having your students find text evidence. Make sure to do it in reverse first and then let them find it maybe on day 2. Okay? All right. We are ready for tip number 4. I love tip number 4, and I have a great resource for you to check out as well. Tip number 4, of course, when teaching characterization is to use strong mentor texts. Sometimes I think we forget about our amazing picture books that we have access to, and that those are our best resources to go to. So I actually have a blog post ready for you that is all about the best mentor text to use when teaching characterization. That link is in the video description. Excuse me. That link is in the video description, which is either below you. You can click show more and find that, or it's above you. I never really know, depending on what device you are on watching this, where the links are, but they're definitely there. Look for them. You can click that link and go check out all of my recommendations for mentor text when teaching characterization. But maybe you are looking for something new that's different from that list. So let's talk a little bit about finding the right mentor text when it comes to teaching characterization. Here's what you need to look for. And I think this is something that some teachers kind of struggle with, is when they're reading a book or trying to find books, they really don't know when and how to pick the right book, right? How do you find the right book to teach the right skill? So we're going to do that right now and focus just on characterization. So I've kind of created like a little bulleted list of aspects that I look for when I'm looking for a book that has strong characterization. So these are things that you can look for in a mentor text. And then these are also areas that you can then discuss with your students about the mentor text that either I've recommended or that you find that match these as well. So obviously we have changing character, which we know is so important, but then also really looking at, does the mentor text show us why, and really go into detail about why the character changes. Character traits is a given. Character relationships, like we've talked about. This is one we haven't talked about yet today, is similarities in characters and the students, or differences in the characters and the students, and then also differences and similarities between the characters. You know, do I have a great mentor text that showcases character A and character B and they're very different, or they're very similar? You know, that would be a great mentor text to pull aside and then have that kind of conversation with. Internal conflict is another great one to look at. Especially if you get into the upper grades where you're really focusing on conflict. Look for that internal or external conflict between characters, or what's really motivating them. What kind of conflict are they having? You know, is it character to character? Is it character to self? Is it character to world? You know, where's the conflict happening? And then being able to analyze different kinds of characters. So look for the different components of which you teach, and look for that strong evidence in the character or the mentor text that you're picking. And then when you find one that has multiple pieces, then you know it's a strong mentor text. So again, I've done the hard work for you. I found the best ones in my honest opinion. So you can check out that link and find some amazing characterization mentor text to use in your classroom. If you go and check it out, make sure to come back and let me know which ones you've used, or which ones you're going to try. Or if you have recommendations for us, drop them in the comments below. I would love to know what your recommendations are. I'm always loving to add to my list as well. So let me know what books you use to teach characterization in your classroom. All right, and we are ready for tip number 5 to end our video today. Tip number 5 is to make sure that you are going beyond the traits. So I think that when we think about teaching characters, a lot of teachers kind of have blinders on, and we teach the traits, right? And maybe one more aspect, and then we don't really go too much more in detail. But when we're teaching the traits, it's really important that we are going above and beyond just understanding what traits are. So a lot of students, they'd like to just focus on the trait. They'll be able to say, you know, a character is stubborn, a character is happy. You know, we always have those words that, you know, we're not allowed to use happy anymore. We can't say the character is sad. We have those X words or no words or whatever you call them in your classroom. And they do this because they're easily able to identify if characters are silly, or if they're serious, or if they're mischievous, or whatever it may be. Like, that's simple for them. But they may have trouble going deeper and understanding the why. So why did a character's emotions change in the story? Or why did the relationship between two characters shift? Did we identify that shift? When did it happen? What occurred when it happened? Then why did it occur? Why was a character having an internal conflict with himself or herself? What was causing that? So just going beyond these traits and getting your students to be able to ask themselves these questions is really important. So it goes beyond just saying the trait is this, but then getting your students to be able to ask themselves the questions and go beyond. So what happens is character trait lessons really turn into asking yourself questions lessons. So that strategy and that skill go hand in hand so well that you definitely want to teach them both at the same time. So come up with your list of questions, and I gave you a few just a minute ago, like a few seconds ago. So rewind, write those down if you want. You definitely can add a lot more to it. But then make sure you focus on modeling these questions for your students when you're teaching characterization, and then getting your students to ask the question. So when you then teach characterization, specifically character traits, you want to make sure that, okay, you've identified a trait, but let's focus on the question. What question do we want to follow that trait up with? And then which question out of the ones on, maybe you create an anchor chart together, which question on the anchor chart applies in this situation? Maybe it's the internal conflict. Maybe it's the conflict between two characters. Maybe it's the relationship shift question, or whichever one, you come up with on the board or on your anchor chart that you want to use. So finding the question and then focusing more on the answer, that's where your students are going to get to that point where they're going deeper into the text. So surface level is the trait, step 2 is the question, final step is the answer to the question. That's really what you want to do when you teach character traits. So focus on that 3 steps: trait, question, answer. Okay? That's your final tip for the day. All right, friends. So hopefully you got a few activity ideas. Hopefully you got a few tips and tricks when teaching characterization. Don't forget to check out my link in the video description for my mentor text blog post that has great mentor text suggestions on teaching characterization. You're going to want to check that out as well. So if you have any other tips, if you have any mentor text suggestions, definitely leave us in the comments. Let me know which tip you liked best tonight. Was it 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5? I cannot wait to hear what you thought about our chat tonight, and what your biggest takeaways are. So thank you so much, and have a fantastic evening. Bye, friends.